Epilogue. It was a lovely day, a beautifully warm day. The sun shone down from a cloudless sky. It warmed the forests and the rivers of life. It warmed the streets and the houses of First Town. And it warmed the entire being of Gagara as she stood on the grounds of the great temple. It was just a shame that Race wasn't there to enjoy it with her. 26 years had passed since the war had ended. Gagara watched sadly as the casket containing her husband was slowly lowered into the ground amid a great amount of pomp and ceremony. A band was playing a solemn tune, and the high priest of the great temple was talking about the life that the Harpy Prince had lived. Gagara already knew all about his life. She'd been with him for most of it. It was strange how moving she found this ceremony. Before Race, Gagara had known very little about love. She had loved her mother, but that was a different kind of love. Race had taught her the true meaning of love. He had shown her what it meant to really care for another. She had loved him, and now that he was gone, she missed him. She missed him greatly. Race had died 4 days ago in Demoth Castle, just 2 days before Gagara's 34th birthday. In truth, he had started to die too, maybe even 3 years earlier. His mind had begun to go. It had been heartbreaking for Gagara to wake up in the morning wondering if the man she loved would even recognise her. There were days when he didn't even seem to know who he was, or even what race he belonged to. In a normal Harpy society, he would have been killed a long time ago. Once the mind was lost, the Harpy was considered of no further use to the village. Fortunately, Race had been living extensively at the castle when the first signs of his dementia had started to afflict him. Race had moved into permanent quarters at the castle as soon as Sir Race and Gagara Damoth had come of age. Gagara, who had spent most of her early life longing to be the leader of the village, had stepped down from her post at the same time as he had. In the end, she realised that one thing she really wanted in this world was to be close to her husband. Sir Race and Gagara Damoth had led the village well. He had slowly returned the village to full strength, although it had taken him the best part of the last 26 years to do so. He even had an heir of his own now, a young male Harpy who had been born less than 2 years ago. His name was Race, in honour of his great-grandfather. Gagara's husband had given her 4 children during their marriage together. 3 of them had rejoined the village, preferring to live among their own kind rather than among the humans. Most of them now had children, and some of them even had grandchildren. 3 of them were with her now, here in the courtyard. Lagnoth, the eldest, was 26 now. She had been quite a powerful huntress in her day, and she had given Sir Race and Gagara Damoth 3 children, one of whom she had named Gagara after her mother. It was one of Gagara Jr.'s children who was the current heir to the chieftain. Gagara Jr. was also the current possessor of Race's Hammerstone ring. The next of Gagara's children was called Agnar. They had named her after Race's first crush, rather than the friend they had both had in the Hope. Agnar was 24. She had 2 children of her own and 4 grandchildren. After Agnar there would have been Nida. Nida had been named after the girl who had saved Race's life during the Battle of Demoth Castle, sacrificing herself to shield Race from the arrows. Nida wasn't there. She had died shortly after her 8th birthday trying to perform a rite of passage. Nida would have been 21 had she still been alive. The youngest of the 4 was 17 and still considered to be of breeding age. Indeed, by the look of it, she was carrying her 3rd child. Her name was Jenny, named after Race's sister. It was an unusual name for a Harpy, but then so was Race. Jenny was the one who had never joined the village. She preferred life at the castle, living with her husband, a male who would most likely have been killed at birth had he been born in any other village. Jenny had recently finished writing a book she called Memoirs of a Huntress. Gagara sighed. She blinked and wished she could show her grief the way humans did by crying. The king had done Race proud. It was a lovely ceremony. The king was standing on the other side of the grave with the other humans. His hand had been regrown. The queen had eventually been able to access the magic in her ring to cast a spell. Queen Jenny stood at his side with their children gathered around them. Whenever Gagara had seen Jenny, she always seemed to have the same haunted look about her. Was she never going to forgive herself for what happened to the elves and the goblins? Gagara couldn't help but feel a wave of sympathy for the king. Supposedly, the dragon had claimed that Race's sister was going to die sometime within the next few days. At the moment, the queen didn't even look sick. Duke Hell was there, of course, with his beloved wife. The Duke had also done Race proud. As soon as the Harpy had died, he had contacted the king. He had then spared no expense in transporting the body in a glass hearse for all to see. Then, with all due ceremony, he had brought the casket to the capital so that the body could be interred in pride of place amidst the graves of the royal family in the graveyard at the great temple. The coffin had been made specially to accommodate Race's wings and tail. Race had been placed into the coffin with his wings wrapped around him like a shroud. Standing next to Kel and his wife and children were Minitilda and her second husband, the current Duke of Rayos. It had been hard to find anyone with noble lineage left in the country. Some, such as Tamatha, who was also watching the ceremony with her own husband and children, could point to their immediate ancestors and claim a certain dukedom by right. Others, though, seemed to have less of a claim than even Race had had. Another among the guests was Anida. Anida was alone. So far she was unmarried, and had shown no interest in ever getting married. She stood close to Jenny and the king. From the sword she carried, it looked as if she was still acting as a bodyguard after all these years. Indeed, she currently held the position as the king's champion and could be found most days training his soldiers. Finally, there was Princess Alice. She stood slightly apart from the others, her husband, the current Duke of Malines, and their 3 children beside her. As with many of those who had suffered from eating the enchanted elven food, she had never fully recovered. But with each year that passed since the elves had vanished, the effects of the food had slowly diminished. Gagara couldn't help thinking how good it was to see so many of her old friends here paying their last respects to her husband. The coffin was lowered the rest of the way into the grave. The high priest of the great temple said a few more meaningful words, mainly about the gods and the afterlife, and then the band struck up a final mournful hymn. Slowly, the congregation that was gathered about the grave began to part. Most of them headed towards the gates of the graveyard. Jenny and the king stayed where they were, their eyes cast downwards towards the grave. "Shall we go?" Lagnoth asked. "If we leave now, we can fly most of the way back before nightfall." "I can't leave yet. I want to stay with my thoughts for a while," Gagara replied. "I'll meet you later at the Royal Harpy Inn." "As you wish, mother," Lagnoth replied. She glanced at her siblings and then launched herself into the air. A few moments later, Gagara's other daughters, granddaughters and great-granddaughters were flying as a flock into the main body of the city. Gagara didn't watch them go. She stood there virtually alone at the side of the grave, her eyes tilted down towards the soil. She watched as a couple of men began to pour dirt reverently on top of the coffin. The king and queen of Froth joined her. They watched as the 2 men worked. Under normal circumstances, the 2 grave diggers would probably have chatted as they worked, but under the watchful eyes of 2 royals and a harpy, they worked in silence. "My last brother," Jenny said sadly. "My husband," Gagara replied. In the last 26 years, she had become very fluent in the Flourish language. Jenny nodded. "I'm sorry for your loss, but he was 34. That's very old for a harpy." "I know," Gagara replied. "I'm also 34. I don't suppose it'll be long before I join him." "Look," Jenny said, "we're hosting a feast at the palace tonight. We're going to celebrate his life and his achievements. I was hoping..." She glanced round at her husband. "We were hoping that you'd agree to come along. We can put you up for the night." "I don't know," Gagara said uncertainly. "My daughters are waiting for me to join them so we can all fly back together." "Please," Jenny pleaded. "You would be the guest of honour. Of all of us, you probably knew my brother best of all. The feast simply wouldn't be the same without you." "We'll send word to your daughters. Let them know what's happening," the king assured her. "And of course we'll ask them to attend. I'm sure we can find rooms for everyone. The palace is a large place." "You can all fly back together in the morning," Jenny agreed happily. Most of the new dukes of the land had come to pay their respects to Gagara at the feast. She was overcome with all the well wishes and the generosity of spirit that many of them had had. She didn't eat a lot herself. Without her husband by her side, she really didn't have much of an appetite these days. After the feast, a servant escorted Gagara to her room. It was a beautifully lavish room. All the furniture seemed to be covered in small gold leaf filigrees. There was a small round table on which was sitting a silver vase of fresh flowers. Even the candle holders seemed to be made from silver. The room had a large double bed with strong oaken headboard decorated in more gold leaf. It looked very comfortable. Gagara removed the skirt that she had worn at the funeral. She had worn it more to suit the sensibilities of the humans and was glad to be rid of it. She placed it over the back of one of the chairs that the royals had provided for her. It had been a hot day. The heat of the day hadn't really lessened that much as the night had drawn in, so before she turned in, she walked over to the window to let in a little bit of air. The window looked down onto the grounds. A beautiful flower garden was located just below her window. It was illuminated at night by some very carefully placed lanterns. The window also faced towards the great temple. She could just about make out its shadow in the dark. She left the window and made her way over to the bed. It had been a long day and she was feeling very tired. She lay down on the bed. Gagara unfurled her wings until they were virtually overlapping the edges of the mattress, making full use of the space provided. She then moved a little so that her tail wasn't directly under her. One of the side effects of living in Castle the Moth with Race was that she had gotten used to comfortable surroundings. She had gotten used to sleeping on a comfortable bed, and this bed was more comfortable than most. She lay back on the bed and sighed. She rested her head down on the pillow and wished she could spend one more night with her husband, but her husband the way he was, back when he still recognised her. She sighed again, and then she sat up enough to blow out the first of the 3 candles that were burning on the bedside stand. As she sat up, she caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head towards the spectacle and watched as a plume of gaseous smoke seemed to float into the room through the opened window. Slowly the smoke took on a recognisable visage of her husband. Slowly it became more and more solid. "Handsome?" Gagara said somewhat uncertainly. She began to wonder if she was already asleep. "Hello, my heart," the spirit replied. He stood at the foot of her bed. He held his hands wide to welcome her. "But we buried you," Gagara said. "I know," Race replied. "I love you. Come to me." Gagara felt she should be scared of the apparition, and yet how could she be afraid of the man she loved? She wasted no time. She threw back the sheets and hurriedly climbed out of the bed. Then she rushed across the room to his awaiting arms. They held each other in a tight embrace for about a minute. Then Race rested his head against hers and asked cryptically, "Are you ready, my angel?" Gagara pulled away for a moment so she could look at him. She had no idea what he meant. She glanced quickly around the room as if it might hold some clue. She looked at the table, the beautiful design of the vase, the flowers, all so full of life. Then she looked at the bed and saw that her body was still lying there where she had left it. She turned back to Race, held him tightly again, and gazing deeply in his eyes, she answered, "Yes, my husband, I am ready."